started on a concrete paver project, you want to carefully lay out an area to excavate that's 6 inches larger in each direction than your finished patio or sidewalk.
To check the corners for square, we measure diagonally across the space. If the two diagonals are the same, the corners are square. And before we do any digging, we have the utility companies mark the locations of any underground pipes or wires.
Once everything is staked out, we begin to dig. We're using a sod cutter to give a nice clean edge. Then we need to go down at least 7 inches. This leaves the right amount of room for the 4-inch base, a layer of sand, and the pavers themselves. The most important thing about the digging we're doing here is that we're trying not to disturb the dirt at the bottom of the hole. This is called skimming. In other words, what we don't want to do is to have loose dirt at the bottom, because after the patio is built up, it'll settle a little and we might end up with a dip in the patio.
With a patio this size, we could dig the whole thing out by hand, but we've decided to bring in a contractor for the real heavy digging. If your excavator doesn't deal much with paver installations, you'll want to be real specific about what you want. Probably the most important thing, just like when we were hand digging, is to scrape out the dirt without disturbing the ground underneath. If he goes too deep, don't let him try to fill it back in and smooth it out.
However, we're running into a typical problem here. It's spring, and it's been kind of rainy here for the past couple of days, so the soil is soft and spongy, and the bottom of the excavation is getting kind of messy. To make up for this, we're going to start bringing some of the base material into the area. The base material will start to solidify the soft, wet soil. This way, he'll be able to drive the bobcat through the area without leaving big ruts. The base material doesn't start being effective until it's been compacted, so we're running the compactor over it now. Well, hopefully, what this is doing is compacting the base material and helping the soil underneath to settle. You see, the house is only about 4 years old, and the dirt we're working on may not have had enough time to settle. And anytime you uncover dirt, well, you run the risk that suddenly may decide it's time to settle. That's why we're compacting it now. It's especially important to compact the soil along the side of the house. What happens next to the house is that the overhang of the roof has kept the ground there from getting wet and settling. Also, in this part of the country, the ground right next to the house may never freeze up during the winter. That's because it's being kept warm by the heat from the basement. And it's the freezing and thawing that helps settle the ground. We rented the compactor for 3 days, and it's costing us about $130. We'll use this to compact the base material and to set the pavers, the very last step. Make sure you get a 4 to 5 horsepower compactor. Anything smaller just isn't going to cut it. This compactor vibrates at 2 frequencies. The low frequency high force setting is for compacting the base material. Later, we'll switch it over to the high frequency low force setting for compacting the pavers into the sand.
Now we check the area for 2 things, flatness and slope. We've got a long, straight 2x6, and we slide this around to find any humps or dips. If we scrape up or fill any areas, we make sure to compact them before we move on to the next step.
To check for the right slope or grade, we put a 2-inch leg on the end of an 8-foot 2x6. This is the grade we want at the bottom, a 1-inch drop for every 4 feet. Now, if the grade is right, then the top of the board will be level.
Where is it? Okay. Okay.
Well, now that we've stabilized the excavation with some base, we can go ahead and add some more base. But before we do that, we're going to make some marks here so we know how much we should add. So we snapped a chalk line here along the foundation. We're going to use a magic marker to make it a little bit more permanent. So what are the V's for?
Well, this way, when the base material covers the line, we can see how much we've got to compact it or rake it.
Oh, okay. That's not a bad idea. Well, I'm going to grab some fabric.
Okay. There's one last thing we want to do before we spread out the main load of base material. This is called geotextile fabric.
Right spot there.
If there's any movement in the soil under the patio, the fabric will actually help hold up the base and the patio. So once this is in, we'll start putting in the base material on top of it. The fabric should go up the side of the excavation. You'll need to slice it to get it to lay flat at the corners. Also, run it a little bit up the side of the house and tape it in place. This will help protect the siding.
In places where you may need to make a seam, make sure you overlap the pieces by at least a foot. Well, to compact this material properly, it has to be just a little bit wet. Sometimes it'll come off the truck just fine. Other times it'll be a little bit too wet, other times a little bit too dry. A good way to test this is to grab a clump of it and see if it'll hold together in your hand. Now that's fine. If it's too dry, it'll just fall apart. If it's too wet, it'll ooze water as you squeeze it. If it is too dry, you'll have to put a sprinkler on it for a while. If it's too wet, just let it dry out for a while. Well, why don't you give us about 15 or 20 minutes, and we should be ready for the rest, all right? Unless you've got some really heavy equipment, it's hard to compact more than 3 or 4 inches of loose material at a time. So we're going to get all this raked out, leveled in, we'll compact it, and then we'll be ready for the next load. First, I run the compactor around the edges of the area twice. Then I start on the low side and work across the grade, moving uphill. Once I've run it all the way to the house, I change direction 90 degrees and start going up and down. Next, I do a diagonal pass. Then I repeat the whole process again. Same 3 passes, same directions.
We've been talking a lot about this base material, but haven't said exactly what it is. Well, it's different in different parts of the country. What we're using is 100% crushed limestone, as recommended by the National Stone Association. It's got an even mix of sizes, a maximum size each piece of 3/4 of an inch all the way down to very fine particles. So sometimes it's called 3/4 minus. Around here we call it class 2.
Well, we're having our Bobcat operator bring in the rest of the base. Now, in contractor lingo, we're doing this in 2 lifts. Each lift is 3 inches deep. And we try to order just enough material so by the time everything's compacted, we have a base that's 4 inches deep.
Okay, well, it's all up to us now. We're using the same steps for the second lift of the base material. I'm just evening it out, and then Dean's going to come through with a compactor and use the same pattern and the same number of passes.